Σας παρακαλώ πολύ να αποδεχθούμε όλοι τον αρχηγό της αξιωματικής αντιπολίτευσης, τον κύριο Κυριάκο Μητσοτάκη, ο οποίος θα συζητήσει μαζί με τον κύριο Peter Spiegel από τους Financial Times. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back here. This is actually my third Delphi Economic Forum. And it's my great pleasure to be sitting next to Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who, of course, needs no introduction, president of New Democracy. I must say the FT and English language press in general has been very bad at political predictions. I predicted President Hillary Clinton and no Brexit, so I want to be careful. But quite possibly...
Feel free to make a prediction.
The next Prime Minister of Greece before the year is out. Possibly. I'm not going to make a prediction. I want to thank Robert for setting me up very well on the issue of governance, because I do want to discuss this with you, because this has, as Robert said, been something of a plague on Greece's houses for some time that you have vowed to tackle. But because we're an economic forum here, why don't we start with economic issues, because it is something that has bedeviled Greece and, as a result, bedeviled Europe for most of the last 10 years. One of the things you talked about when you were here last year, and you continue to talk about quite a bit as leader, is tax cuts. Tax cuts are a mainstream center-right policy that most European and American center-right parties advocate for. But Greece is in a unique situation in that, I saw Joaquin Almunia here earlier, you have something of an overseer in Europe that is demanding, some would argue, and I think the FT has argued this, rather unreasonable primary budget surpluses forever. As someone who is advocating tax cuts, the economic growth that tends to come with a tax cut takes some time. How do you square the circle? How do you maintain primary surpluses of rather large percentages at the same time cutting your revenues?
First of all, let's recognize that the current government has gone overboard by overtaxing the middle class, by creating unnecessarily large primary surpluses, much larger than what was actually requested by our creditors, and then redistributing those excess surpluses in the form of electoral handouts. This has been the policy of the current government. And it's the wrong policy. It's the wrong policy because it essentially kills all the productive forces within the Greek economy. So I think if you talk to every mainstream economist today, they will tell you that tax cuts are absolutely necessary, and we would start by cutting corporate taxation and taxation on real estate. These are measured tax cuts. They can be counterbalanced not just by specific spending cuts, but by also taking into consideration that the budget has overperformed over the past years. So instead of giving out Christmas gifts at the end of each year, I would advocate tax cuts for the middle classes. This is clearly, in my mind, the right policy. It will have, I think, a short-term positive effect on the economy, and it will allow us to build and give us time to implement the deeper and more profound structural reforms that have to do with governance issues and how do we actually run the country. Now, on the issue of primary surpluses, because I think this is very important. 2.5 years ago, I made the point in Thessaloniki that we should offer Europe a new sort of grand bargain. We would commit ourselves to very specific structural reforms, which would include interventions in the way we actually run the country in exchange for lower primary surpluses. And I made the point that this is actually a good deal for our creditors, not just for us. Because the higher growth we have, the greater chance that we will have to repay our debts. At the time, I was very lonely. There was this general sense that we are stuck with primary surpluses that are way too high, but nobody had the courage to actually address the issue. I see more traction now. And I think the reason why I see more traction has to do with a simple question of credibility. We got put into this vicious cycle for the simple reason that Mr. Tsipras does not have any credibility when it comes to delivering reforms. So these primary surpluses were imposed upon us as a result of the third program, which in itself was also completely unnecessary. And I think that the new government, with a strong public mandate, but also with credibility when it comes to reforms, can discuss with our creditors, always in good faith, about a solution that's going to be a win-win solution. And I'm happy that for the first time, European leaders are beginning to address this question. Manfred Weber raised the question when he was here. Pierre Moscovici raised the question. The only person who doesn't seem to raise the question is the Prime Minister himself, which is interesting, because he was the one who actually negotiated these high surpluses. So, I mean, my offer still is very public, and it stands. Let's discuss with the government, the current government, a strategy of how to renegotiate lower primary surpluses. It will be good for us, it will be good for Europe.
I want to get to this idea of a grand bargain because I think it's a very important one to address. But let me push you one more time on budget surpluses, because your answer does seem to sound like the normal sort of waste, fraud, and abuse that every government that comes in says we can solve our problems if we just get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. Is there anything that actually needs to be cut from the muscle? Are there hard budget decisions you have to make to fund the tax cuts, or do you think this is all going to come out of money that surplus is misspending on political favor?
First of all, let me again point out that we overperformed. Look at 2016, for example. Our target at 2016 was 0.25% of our surplus. We ended up delivering 4%. So we have overtaxed the real economy. We need to address the problem of fat without cutting into the lean muscle, because there's little muscle left in terms of public services. But let me give you two very specific examples. First of all, the size of the public administration. I was in charge of this portfolio when I was a minister. And it's sort of sad that at a time when we had contained public spending related to public administration, that we see again this spending in terms of the actual wage bill ballooning. Look at the recent report produced by the European Commission. We are hiring more people, especially through temporary contracts, that we actually need. And we're doing it because we are reverting to the old patronage politics that ruined and bankrupted this country. So there's clear room in addressing issues that have to do with the wage bill. Also, I think part of our public spending is still quite inefficient. We announced last Saturday, I think, a very forward-looking plan regarding healthcare. And how do we further streamline healthcare spending without compromising on the quality of the healthcare? Because we're currently, as citizens, contributing significantly to our healthcare system through social security and healthcare contributions, but the system remains very inefficient. When we still have today hospitals that cannot pool their purchasing, that are buying equipment on a 3-month basis, when there is no cooperation whatsoever with the private sector in terms of using best practices that have proven to be effective, not just in terms of containing costs, but also in terms of delivering better services. This is, for example, one area where I'm quite comfortable that we can squeeze out savings, which should then again be redirected in the quality of the healthcare system. But we have to be realistic. Unless there is more growth, which is also driven by structural reforms, and when I say more growth, Peter, I'm very specific. This country cannot grow at 2% or 1.5 at 2%. We'll be destined to always be laggards in Europe, and we will never give a sense to the Greek people that this crisis has actually come to an end. The targets that we should set is between 3 and 4%. This growth in itself is not just going to be driven by tax cuts. It's also going to be driven by real supply-side reforms. But this is a sort of growth that will help us also address the revenue question. And when I talk about reforms, let's look also at what's happening with tax reform in general. We've been sort of accused by the European Commission that we're hiring people where we don't need them, and we're not hiring people in our independent revenue agency. We have the tools to be more effective and more targeted in addressing tax evasion, and I intend to do that. We should do more with electronic payments. You raise VAT way too much. You raise taxation way too much. People will, eventually tax evade. You have no instruments in containing it. You go today to a taverna, and you'll be, you really have to ask hard for a receipt. This is the reality, unless we don't want to see it. So I'm advocating a carrot and stick approach, and this is also my fair sort of grand bargain to the business community. By business community, I don't just mean the big businesses. I also mean the small businesses. I'm going to lower your taxes. I'm going to make your life easier in terms of regulation, but I expect you to pay your taxes. And I am going to be very, very strict with incidents of tax evasion. And by the way, we have the tools now to find if you're tax evading.
Let me just touch on your ambitious 3 to 4% growth target, because that is rather ambitious. Is unfortunately your timing maybe a little bit off in that we unfortunately seem to be heading into a global slowdown with Europe perhaps at the lead of this? Obviously, Mario Draghi last month after his meeting raised the alarms that he may need to slow down on unwinding some of his QE. Are you unfortunately perhaps coming to office or potentially coming to office at a time when that 3-4% growth target is actually just not realistic?
Well, this is something I cannot control. What I can say, and I don't want to dwell too much about the past, I think this really should be a discussion about the future. The one thing that I will say is that it is a colossal pity that we lost 3 excellent global macroeconomic years at a time when all our competitors were growing. Look at the other post-program countries, look at Cyprus, look at Portugal, and we underperformed. And this is a responsibility of the current government. Yes, we're entering into a more challenging period, but at the same time, I have an obligation, if the Greek people entrust us with leading the country, to make Greece a success story. And I think at a time of greater instability, at a time when the politics in Europe are going to look rather confusing, the fact that you may end up in Greece with a moderate, pro-reform, competent, I focus on the issue of competency, hard-working, center-right government, I think is going to make Greece attractive for foreign capital. And all those investments we talk about, all this sort of leveraging of the natural comparative advantages that the country has, I think we can benefit. There are still a lot of low-hanging fruits. I mean, you mentioned that this is the most wonderful country in terms of its geography. It's true, but how do we leverage it? How do we connect our tourism to our culture, to our agribusiness sector, to technology, to renewable energy? It's all there. I mean, Greece has the potential to do great things in a challenging environment. So I can do what I can about the risks that I have to manage, but I'm not going to waste too much time thinking about what could have happened had the government been more serious. I have to look into the future.
Let me get back to your grand bargain, because it is very compelling. I must say, though, having spent 6 years in Brussels and watched various Greek governments come in and make frequently, even particularly in the pre-Tsipras era, rather compelling arguments about renegotiating, they were consistently knocked down. I remember Venizelos coming in as finance minister, coming to the Eurogroup and demanding a renegotiation of the second MOU. That lasted maybe 2 hours in Luxembourg, I remember this. And you will remember the Samaras government, he too wanted to renegotiate. That lasted, I think, a couple weeks. And then most tragically, Tsipras came in and said, I want to renegotiate too. And it took him months to realize that he couldn't do it and almost pushed the country out of the Eurozone. I guess my question to you is, and knowing how the Germans in particular, they're a bit weak right now, they're going through a transition, how does a new prime minister succeed in finding a way to renegotiate this when almost every one of your predecessors has failed?
First of all, renegotiation is a no-no. We don't use that. We don't use that word because exactly of the history it has. I've been very, very clear. I don't want to do it immediately. I don't want to do it necessarily on day one. I've said, give me 6 to 12 months to prove that I'm serious in terms of reforms. So, and if we have to live with a 2020 budget, sticking to the targets of 3.5% for 2020, so be it. But after that, 2021, 2022, and the long-term primary surpluses post-2022, we have to take a look at that. And also, if you look at the debt sustainability analysis, I mean, why are the primary surpluses so high? Because our underlying growth rate is so low. If you put Greece on a different growth trajectory, the debt analysis suddenly looks much better. So what I'm saying is, no, this is not the issue I would raise at my first council meeting. I would first deliver results. I would build credibility. I want to take Greece back to investment grade within 18 months. I'm very committed to that. We need to borrow as a normal country. We are currently, yes, we may, I understand, issuing, new debt relatively soon, but our borrowing costs are still way, way too high. We don't have normal access to the capital market, so this needs to be changed, and we need to really demonstrate that we have changed in terms of tackling the underlying foundations of the problem. And unfortunately there, I'm going to be a little bit critical with our European partners. A lot of the real issues have been put under the rug. Frankly, our European partners are not doing us a favor when they turn a blind eye to issues that have to do with education, with justice, with public administration, where we have moved in the completely wrong direction over the past years by saying, yeah, everything's okay, you're meeting your fiscal targets, and these are sort of issues which you have to deal with. But at the end of the day, these are issues which we, and this is an agenda which we need to own. I don't need anyone to tell me that we need private universities in Greece. I don't want to have it in a memorandum. I want to go to the Greek public and tell them, I want your mandate and I want your vote to change the constitution to set up private universities in Greece. It's not a question of doing it because someone has told us to do so. So the agenda has to be our own. And frankly, I think sometimes we can be more sophisticated than our European creditors when it comes to what the real reforms are. The topic is inclusive growth. And this is going to be the real challenge. The real challenge is how are we going to convince your salaried employee who currently lives on 500 euros working in the private sector that there's something in it for him, and not just for the shareholders, or not just for the managers of the firms, for the small business owner, for the self-employed Greek. This is what we really should do. I don't see much of this happening today. It's not just about the minimum wage. The minimum wage is just one tool one can use. But these are really the issues we try to address in our program. I think we have a very clear program. We've laid it out to the Greek people. We've stayed away from populistic claims, and I've been very, very careful to moderate our program. Sometimes it may come across as being very detailed. One could even argue almost technocratic. I don't mind. You know, we have difficult questions to address, and I think we've done a good work in putting together a program that's not just an electoral program, but also will help us to govern better the day after.
Let me ask you to address a little bit more of this issue of building credibility. As we Americans say, this is not your first rodeo. I think you and I first met when you were a public administration minister, and as part of the Samaras government, you know, for a good couple years, you built credibility. I mean, that government, you did the hard work in that department, building up the public administration. Samaras executed on the program, and yet, even after that, the stubbornness of the Germans in particular, but the EU more generally, you had, we know, several fights with the IMF on this. Is building credibility enough at a time when it doesn't seem like Brussels is in a place to want to revisit the Greek issue?
Well, again, we are under a form of supervision. It may not be as tight as it was when we were in an actual program, but essentially we are under supervision, and there is a degree of conditionality to the extent that we're going to receive money from the ANFAs and the SNPs in exchange of reforms. There is a degree of conditionality. Again, we need to be honest. There is Greece fatigue in Brussels today, and we don't want to cause additional problems. So, on the other hand, one needs to be aware of the fact that Greece, still owes our European creditors a lot of money. Everybody, I think, wants to make Greece a real success story. First of all, we should be wanting this for ourselves. But I think also in Europe there is a desire to do so. And frankly, there's also a political argument, Peter. At a time when there is a rise of populists across the board, and by the way, populists, we can discuss upon this later if you want to, from the extreme right or from the extreme left, they have lots of similarities. At a time where you need sort of to make sure that you counter this populist surge, you also need success stories. And I think we can make Greece a real success story. And that's why I think the Greek story will resonate beyond Greece. It is not just about Greece. Greece was the first country to elect populists into power. It was a disaster. They failed. They failed the Greek people, first of all. They failed the Greeks who believed that Tsipras could actually deliver on all these promises. So if the pendulum is going to swing back to something different, what is this different? What I am proposing is a rejuvenated and more socially conscious version of the traditional center-right party. This is what we're trying to do. So this is a story which I think also for the European People Party, for Europe as a whole, is going to be relevant.
I want to address that. I want to get to politics, but let me, before I do, get to this issue of governance, because this is, frankly, probably your biggest calling card, having, as I said, done this before as a minister, but obviously having background in this in the private sector. When I ask people around Greece who follow Greece about, here we have a leader who's going to come in who has some expertise in this area, the biggest concern is, yes, that is true, but he's a member of a party that is a very old party, that's a very clientelistic party, that is going to be very difficult to shed those feathers, essentially. That how does Mitsotakis navigate in a party where bureaucrats who are identified as new democratic bureaucrats, directors of departments, are going to want those old jobs back, regardless of their credibility? How do you navigate within that political party that is expecting to get the jobs for the boys back?
First of all, I'm very proud to be leading Nea Demokratia. It's a party that, in spite of its mistakes, has contributed a lot to this country, and we should not forget that. And sometimes I'm a little bit angry when I hear, all this story about the old establishment parties ruining the country. There is some truth to this, but nobody's looking at the other side. What happened during that period, stable democracy, Nea Demokratia leading, the charge towards Europe. There are also good things we can retain. Interesting enough, those who make the comment about the old establishment are the first to welcome into their party, meaning Syriza, all the leftovers from the old establishment, of this world, and then they talk about, the old parties having welcomed everybody into their own party. But I'm going to be very, very open with you. There is no room for making any compromises when it comes to meritocracy. The best people should get the jobs, and this is what I tried to do when I was a minister. I was the first to put in place an appraisal system for general directors, directors, and heads of department, because that's the way that civil administration needs to be run. And when I was a minister, and people who worked with me can testify that I never asked what people were voting for. And by the way, we have incredible people in the Greek public administration, incredible people, hardworking, dedicated. They have no incentive to work now except for their pride, but this is not enough. That's why, performance management systems, rewarding, high performers by giving them a better career track within the administration, building skills that a modern administration needs, technological breakthrough, very important. We need as little interaction. If there's little interaction with a physical person, there's little room for corruption. Data can be very objective. So technology is a big help. We've made the public administration more transparent. There were reforms made in the past, such as our Viavia reform, which means that every decision is publicized on the internet, which were very, very important in terms of opening up transparency. And then, of course, there's the question of where do you draw the line? How do you attract talent into politics? Not always easy. If this is a forum of talented people, if I ask people, raise your hands if you're interested in getting, if you're successful in your private job, interested in getting a job in the public, do what is done so frequently in the US, you take some time off, work for the public sector. Not many people are going to do that because politics have been discredited, because you have judges who sometimes have a sense that they can prosecute everyone without any sense of protection. And because everyone who spends time in public life is perceived as having other intentions. It's not going to change from day one. I'm pretty sure we'll win the next elections. I'm not sure we're going to convince everyone. Obviously, we're not going to convince everyone about our intentions. But then we have to deliver through results. And I know people are also extremely cynical. You can do 100 good things. You can make one mistake. And mistakes always happen, and then social media are going to zero in on this. But that's it is what it is. But I think we've changed the party a lot. We've given lots of opportunities to new people. We'll be presenting lots of new people in our party lists. We'll present lots of new people in our list for members of the European Parliament from all walks of life, very representative. And I'm proud about what we've done with our party. You should not forget, I took over a party that was defeated. We had lost 4 elections in a row. Everybody thought we were on a downward spiral. And right now, we're probably one of the strongest parties within the EPP family in Europe. So, but obviously we're not complacent because there's still a lot of hard work to do until the elections.
You mentioned an effort to try to get the best people and perhaps some in the room to come work under a Mitsotakis government. But as you say, I mean, having followed Greek politics now for almost 10 years, it's a bloody sport. And there is one case in particular that became very symbolic for the international community, I think, which is the former head of the Statistics Office, Andres Georgiou. I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Georgiou. What is your view about that case? Because it has become something of a symbolic case of a man who's viewed internationally, at least, of having done the right thing and then ending up being prosecuted in Greece repeatedly because of that.
Well, I hope this story is over now.
Okay.
Because after the final court decision, and it's about time.
Okay, okay. Let me turn to politics. And you mentioned European politics. And you talk about and warned against the rise of populism. Now, obviously, there is populism on both sides. Greece has suffered from populism on the left. But there is, in your own house, in the European People's Party, there is Fidesz, the Hungarian party that, let's be honest, is advocating what can only be called populist policies, illiberal democracy, demonizing Jews, demonizing Muslims. How do you feel as a leader in the EPP that someone like Viktor Orban is a member of your family?
I'm not happy. I've raised the questions, these issues repeatedly. I think illiberal democracy is a fundamentally flawed concept. It flies into the face of all the values we have as EPP members. And the approach that Prime Minister Orban is taking regarding migration is also highly problematic. I'm the first to advocate that we need to protect our borders, the first, because we're a border country. And there is no way we can have free movement of people within the European Union without effectively protecting our borders, and I want the European Union to be more engaged in this. I want a clear distinction between refugees and economic migrants. At the same time, it is very unfair within the concept of burden sharing to say that this is a problem that's just relevant to Greece because it happens to be a border country, and we do not want to participate in any burden sharing for refugees, not for migrants. For refugees, for people who are entitled international protection. I've voiced my displeasure repeatedly. I can tell you that the recent letters that were sent by Orban, in my mind, are crossing a red line. I will be sending on Monday a letter to the European People's Party requesting the suspension of Fidesz until this issue is resolved. We can no longer pretend as if nothing is happening. It is a real problem. We've tried to keep it within the family. I hope we'll be able to resolve it within the family. And I hope that at least at the end, Mr. Orban changes his approach. But the way he continues to behave, he can no longer be a member of the EPP. And we need to give him the benefit of the doubt by placing him on suspension. And if he does not change, he does not have a position within the European People's Party. One more point. I understand the criticism because I've been also a vocal critic. But when we talk about illiberal democracy, I can tell you, just look at the recent report in terms of populism. There are 2 countries that come out ahead. The first is Hungary, and the second is Greece. I would expect the same sensitivity that people show about Mr. Orban, that they also show it when it comes to Mr. Tsipras, when it comes to interventions in justice, when it comes to intervention in media, when it comes, the way he attacks his political opponents, the way he tries to take over regulatory agencies, the fact that he's trying to build his own sort of state apparatus. So I would expect similar sensitivity, especially by the European socialists, who suddenly seem to have fallen, in love with Mr. Tsipras, because he may, add a few seats in the total European tally. So we have to address these issues regardless of where they come from. Greece is facing today not just a challenge to its economy, it's also facing a challenge to its democracy. Things that have happened under this government go way beyond what has happened in the past. And building what I call a functioning and credible and inclusive democracy is also going to be an important challenge for the next government.
Let me stick with Orban just for one more question, because I think you've made some news here, which is obviously down to my incisive questioning, clearly. I'm curious, why now the red line? I mean, you have obviously been leader of New Democracy for a while now, a significant player in the EPP for a while, and he has been acting out, for lack of a better word, for some time. What is it about what he's done recently that you think is the red line that warrants him being suspended, kicked out from the EPP?
I mean, it's a constant behavior, and this is an issue that has been raised by me repeatedly. And unfortunately, I don't see a change in the behavior. And we are, 90 days before the Euro elections. This is not going to be. We as an EPP have, I think, a very forward-looking agenda in terms of protecting our borders, in terms of inclusive growth, in terms of technology. I'm not willing to let this agenda be hijacked because we constantly have to defend ourselves. Because one of our members in a medium-sized country is behaving the way it does. I mean, there has to be some solidarity and some consideration for the broader cause of the party. And, we all have at some point to make compromises if we want to belong to a European family, and he has shown no indication that he's willing to do so.
Let me stick with this topic, because there are critics of your leadership of New Democracy who would say there are some of these elements even within your own party. I mean, New Democracy has always had a bit of a nationalistic wing. And there are people, even in your leadership group, who have track records of, how can we put this delicately, not necessarily treating human rights at the higher of the list, gay and lesbian rights, minority rights. Some people blunt with you have said, Mitsotakis in some ways has disappointed us. We thought that he would sort of expunge New Democracy of some of these more nationalistic elements, and he hasn't. Is that a fair criticism?
There is no one within New Democracy today who does not adhere to our basic principles. No one. And if anyone tries to deviate from fundamental issues of principle, they have no position within New Democracy. But we are a big center-right party. And as a big center-right party, there's obviously some room to maneuver. And yes, we have people who would define themselves as more traditional right-wing supporters. We have people who define themselves as more moderate liberals, and we can actually make this work. And we've proven that we can make this work, and that's why we're a big center-right party. But everybody knows there are lines that cannot be crossed, especially when it comes to human rights, protection of minority is an issue. In Greece, whenever we have these issues, there's no room to maneuver. And if anything, I've tried very hard for Nea Dimokratia to have a more socially conscious agenda. I want to speak to groups of disenfranchised citizens who never had contact with Nea Dimokratia, just because we have to make the case that we're actually here for those who feel disenfranchised and who feel that they are the weakest, and groups that the political system never actually spoke to. So this is an important agenda for me, and there's no room for compromise on this issue.
Let me put a scenario that supporters of yours or fans of yours in Europe have put to me that concerns them. They said, look, we understand that although he has the famous name, that Mitsotakis in many ways is an outsider. He spent most of his career in the private sector, sometimes outside of Greece. So he is not someone who walks into the party, and I think you even argued this when you were running for leader, that comes with the weight of history. As a result, you had to build credibility within the party. We understand why he may have been forced to take it easy, perhaps, on some of the more right-wing elements in your party. But when he gets into office, he's going to now have to deal with them and the constant whispering in the ear. And I remember very distinctly another man with a very famous name, Papandreou, came in, and he had a very similar background in that big name, that spent most of his time outside the country, came in as a reformer, but that sort of deep PASOK, that sort of old clientelistic bit of PASOK, eventually turned on him and forced him to reverse himself. Is that a concern when you, that again, these are allies of yours, I think, in Brussels and elsewhere, who are concerned that right wing of the party at some point is going to be difficult for you once you're in power?
No, this is a comparison I really don't like.
Okay.
But let me address your question. First of all, yes, I consider myself, I was sort of an insider-outsider. You remember you were kind enough to interview me when I was presenting my candidacy, when not many people thought I could win. And the reason why I managed to win was because I mobilized lots of people outside of the party who actually came in an open primary vote to vote for me. I guess I did build my career outside politics, and I've been sort of a slightly more of a maverick within Nea Dimokratia, and not always agreeing with the main decisions taken by the party. As a leader, I have an obligation to be inclusive. That's my job, to listen. But then, you know, at the end of the day, decisions that I have to take are mine and mine alone. There is no room for compromise the day after, for the simple reason that I've also studied, you know, the history of other prime ministers who I think everybody starts with good intentions, but the results were not very promising, and the country paid a heavy price. And I don't intend to be, you know, another prime minister in this cycle of prime ministers that are actually recycled by the crisis. I want to be the prime minister, have the privilege of being the prime minister, to lead the country for good out of the crisis. So I've looked at mistakes, you know, other people made, Papandreou, for example, I mean, he spent 6 months trying to supposedly not getting it, and at a time when it was clear that you know, the country was heading towards bankruptcy, he was handing out money. So he made big mistakes, and there's one more distinction. Papandreou was handed the party on a silver plate. I had to fight very hard to get to where I am.
Let me push one more time on this, and I'll try to answer this in a sensitive way, because I know it's a very difficult issue here in Greece. When you talk again to these critics, they point to the issue of Northern Macedonia as the liberal European Mitsotakis being pulled in a nationalistic way. That it is the right wing of your party that is forcing you to vocally oppose this deal. Now, I will grant you that as a foreign correspondent, I always say there are issues that foreigners will never understand. I think this is an issue that's very hard for anyone outside of Greece to understand. But these are serious people who are normally allies of yours, who have been very critical of you for taking such a, one would say, nationalistic view of what is widely regarded as a rather groundbreaking agreement.
70% of Greeks think this is a bad agreement. 95% of people who vote for Nea Dimokratia tell us it's a bad agreement. So this is not a question of balancing of different views. There was no real other dissenting view within Nea Dimokratia regarding this agreement, and I'll explain to you why. And it does not just have to do with the name. First of all, the process. I mean, what happened here? Suddenly, out of the blue, the issue emerges. Mr. Tsipras makes no effort whatsoever to engage the opposition. He has a clear agenda dividing the opposition on this issue. There was no doubt about that. Tried to cause Nea Dimokratia problems. And then subsequently, we have a solution that for the first time acknowledges something no previous government was willing to acknowledge, and that is the existence of a Macedonian language and essentially of a Macedonian ethnicity. Not citizenship, ethnicity, with their own distinct cultural, language, civilization. That is a definition of an ethnic identity. No Greek government in a complicated region of the Balkans has ever acknowledged this. And nobody explained to us why they don't have the Northern Macedonian, at least, nationality. Why is it that Bulgaria, which accepted what we call now Northern Macedonia as Republic of Macedonia, from day one, never ever accepted the existence of a Macedonian language. What did they see that we did not see? And at the end of the day, yes, these are, history has a heavy weight in these parts of the world. And northern Greece became part of Greece, 100 years ago. It's not that far. And people are proud of their identity. And something, they also felt that the government treated them with disrespect. When you tell everyone who's sensitive about this issue, even the people who tell us, I don't want the name Macedonia at all in the name, you tell them you're a nationalist, you're a zealot, essentially you belong to the extreme right. What are you telling all those people? That 70% of the Greek population are nationalists? And what happens to democratic legitimacy at the end of the day? I was never, and I don't believe that we solve these sorts of problems with referendum. I'm very clear. But isn't there a question of legitimacy? Who takes a decision, and on behalf of who? And how was this decision taken in Parliament? What majority supported this decision? We are in constitutionally uncharted waters today. You have a different majority that voted for the Prespers Agreement. You have a different majority that is currently supporting the government. Nobody seems to care about these issues. I mean, these are issues of profound, constitutional order. So I'm trying my best to explain my position. I think it is important to understand that these are real sensitivities in northern Greece, and I've said it very clearly that my main responsibility, as much as I'm interested in what's happening in the Balkans, and I've never said I don't want any deal, but my main responsibility is I'm not going to allow this deal to destabilize Greece because we want to stabilize the region. And there was a real risk that this could actually happen, especially with feelings in northern Greece being very, very inflamed on this issue. I mean, this goes at the core of the identity problem. And what I'm going to tell my friends who have companies in northern Greece who use the prefix Macedonian, from Macedonian chairs to Macedonian glasses, and right now they're completely unprotected. So there's also no protection of the brand Macedonia right now when it comes to commercial use. So these are real issues, and I've made it very clear that those are the reasons why we disagree. We never ever inflamed tension. We were very much against any sort of violence or any protest that went beyond what is acceptable. But these are the minority. The minority of the people are those who are extremists. Majority of the people who showed up and protested and who tell us they don't like the agreement are reasonable people. They're not extremists.
I mean, given your misgivings, particularly on this issue of Macedonian ethnicity and language, is this something you will reopen as Prime Minister?
What I've said very clearly is that we have an international agreement that I did not like, I do not like. It's a ratified international agreement, and I'm going to respect this agreement. If there are issues around the margins that we can work with, we will do that. I will protect the interests of Greek companies. And in the accession process towards the EU, I've said it very clearly that Greece retains all its rights, including veto rights, if it feels its national interests are not protected. But the agreement, and I've said it very clearly in Parliament, and I've put everyone in front of their responsibilities. A ratified international treaty is a ratified international treaty. Greece is a country that respects international law. We try to solve our differences through international law. And as much as I don't like the agreement, I have to respect a ratified agreement by the Hellenic Republic.
One last question on this, but then we're almost out of time. I got the bell here. You mentioned, we now have the slightly odd image of Alexis Tsipras wandering around Europe. He showed up at the FT a few weeks ago, projecting himself as a statesman. I never thought I would see this. But you mentioned something that I think is rather telling. I know my Greek history. I know the last Mitsotakis to be prime minister was brought down on this very issue. Do you think this was more about tactical domestic politics, about unsettling your leadership, than it was perhaps being a real European statesman?
I think that the main reason why Mr. Tsipras initiated this process was tactical. And I think he ended up delivering an agreement that is not good for the country. Essentially, he said no. He said yes, where everybody else in the past had said no, and with good reason. And as you mentioned, my late father, who was a reasonable moderate politician. I have no doubt whatsoever, no doubt that he would never have accepted a Macedonian language and Macedonian ethnicity had he handled the situation. But, leadership is about making people's lives better. It's about telling the truth. It's about having values. It's about going against, the trend. Mr. Tsipras is no leader in that context. So the question of him trying to project a different image may, resonate with some circles in Brussels or abroad, but I'm expecting for Mr. Tsipras to hit the campaign trail and make his case of why he should get a third term in office. I'm pretty sure the Greeks are going to tell him, we've had enough, we want to change, and we're going to elect new democracy.
All right, which brings me to my last ultimate question, which is the question I know everyone wants to ask. When are the elections, and how much are you going to win by?
The elections are on May 26th.
Well, the European elections or the general elections?
The European we know we have elections for a fact. Sometimes people ask me when we have elections. Well, we have elections on May 26th. It's a fact. So let's not forget that. And if some of my people feel that they want to take the summer off, contemplating an election in October, no, I'm not having any of that. I don't know. The sooner the better. I think that if you look at the reaction of the market, I think that the investment committee is already essentially maybe pricing in the fact that there's a political change. For the first time, an election is going to be called. In the past, you remember, there was talk of elections in Greece and everyone, oh my God, disaster, instability. Now I think the day the election is going to be called, a lot of people are going to breathe a sigh of relief. If the Euro elections take place on their own, so be it. We will run a national campaign. This is also going to be, the first time Greek people will have the opportunity to express their views vis-à-vis the current government. Mr. Tsipras has the option of losing simultaneously in one go or in 2 rounds. It's his choice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.